So the simple answer as to whether or not Sunesis as a religion is biblical is no. But the complication comes in Genesis. There's a couple things to go over here. This is the King James Version I have flipped out. We have to go all back to Genesis, to the flood story, the flood narrative. It's pretty popularly known, basically. It's said that God flooded the earth, and one man, Noah, and his descendants were all that remained. Following the flood, there was the famous rainbow that was set in the sky as a sort of symbol. But the verse I want to lay focus on in particular in this part is it says, "And I, behold, I will establish my covenant with you and your seed after you, and with every living creature." And this is God in the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, that's speaking to every living creature, establishing a basic covenant. And at this point, this is where a term that is fairly well known in the religion of Judaism called the Noahide covenant comes in. This is where the Noahide covenant is. It's basically the Noahide covenant pertaining to the story of Noah and the origin story of humanity, is when God or Hashem made a worldwide nationless covenant with all of humanity, specifically with Noah. And as far as Sunesis, the religion, is concerned, this is where the biblical authority begins to wane, is at this covenant. And I'll explain why. So basically what you had was humanity as a whole. According to the origin story, this is a sort of universal covenant which God or Hashem, as Hashem is the reference, is what modern Judaism calls God. God has many names that appear in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, for example, as well as the New Testament. Hashem is probably the most popular, would be my guess. But this is a universal covenant that's pertaining to all people, all nations, and even all creatures, as we saw in the verse. This covenant covers everybody. And this is what the rabbis have called over the years Noahide covenant. In other words, the covenant to Hashem, the one God, from the nations, excluding the nation of Israel. This is according to the rabbinic teachings, what should distinguish the rest of the nations from the nation of Israel. So, the covenant of Noah goes along, that's universal. What you have happen is, of course, Abram becomes Abraham. He gives birth to the nation of Isaac. And then from Isaac we get Jacob. And Jacob becomes Israel. It's the nation of Israel. Now, years after this sequence, according to the Hebrew tradition, is when Moses makes the famous, the well-known covenant on Sinai, Mount Sinai, after leaving the clutches of Egypt and all that. This is the origin story of Judaism. This is the Jewish covenant. Now I'm going to get back to Sunesis and how this all ties in. The Sinai covenant, which the Jews make the origin story, or recall their origin story at the Sinai covenant with the Ten Commandments. This includes not just the Ten Commandments, but also the 613 what's called mitzvot. Mitzvah, I think, is singular, but mitzvot. These are the 613 laws which every observant Jew is said to have to follow. This includes all of Deuteronomy, things in Leviticus, etc., etc. Moses basically retroactivated the original covenant with the father nation, or the father, literally the patriarch Abraham, and that's where that comes from. The Jewish covenant was never meant to be universal. It was meant to be specific to the nation of Israel. However, as is popularly known, what winded up happening was, after the resurrection, so to speak, of the nation state of Israel, there was the Babylonian exile in the 500s before the Common Era. Following a bunch of exile time, a lot of what Christians call the Old Testament, or parts of the Tanakh is what the Jews call it, occurred, resulting in, finally, until we get into closer to the modern age, when the province of Judea became gradually puppeteered by, this is the Mediterranean, here is Egypt. It became gradually puppeteered and then eventually overtaken by Rome. This is where we get closer to the beginning of what is known today as the Common Era, which is just an academically sound, insane way of saying the Christian era, what used to be called AD, or Anno Domini. Anno Domini. But that's Christocentric, so whatever. We'll go with the Common Era. In other words, the year zero. What winded up happening was that because of the friction and the conflict that was taking place with Rome, Judea, the Jews, and Rome finally met in a cataclysmic conflict that lasted decades of guerrilla warfare and taking down, until finally this entire region was just absorbed into what was called Palestine, Syria, etc., and just became another part of the Roman Empire, resulting in the diaspora of the Jews, which spread throughout the Mediterranean and stuff. But this is when the famous Jesus, or Yeshua of Nazareth, and his cult came about. The centuries following Yeshua's ministry, this is the origin story of Christianity. Christianity's contention, and I mean contention, over the following decades and centuries, developed into basically not a refutation of the original Moses covenant on Sinai, the house of Israel, but a quote-unquote fulfillment of that original Jewish covenant. Famously, Christ, or Jesus, was said to have said that I came not to replace the law, but to fulfill it. And what he meant were the mitzvot, the 10 Commandments, just being the 10 most famous of the mitzvot, the Jewish religion as a whole. So what they later became known as, were Christians, who were originally just observant Jews. Christianity was pretty much born. Later down the line, this is when Rome literally adopts this so-called new covenant. Now, I understand in this video I am hopping and skipping over a lot of stuff, but in order to make the point of this video, this is what I have to do. So the new covenant is what Christianity is, the fulfillment back to the original Sinai covenant, which was a sort of revival or fulfillment of the original Abrahamic covenant, going way back into the far reaches of history. So what does any of this have to do with Sunesis? This is where our friend Noah comes in his story. Setting aside literal interpretations, basically the story of Noah is the destruction of the earth, or the reset, literally, of the earth and humankind, and then the placement of a universal covenant from the universal one God for all of humanity, regardless of tribe, nation, etc. Israel, the house of Israel, the covenant of Israel, the one that's from Mount Sinai, the one that today we call Judaism, is the origin of Christianity. Sunesis, as a religion, harkens back to this point: the universal covenant with the one God, or the oneness of God. So when somebody was asking, is Sunesis as a religion biblical or not in any appreciable way. And the reason I say not in any appreciable way is that, as we saw in the biblical verse, the so-called universal covenant excludes the entire story of the rest of the Bible, or the mitzvot, or any of the laws. And the rabbis have actually given us 7 specific laws, derived, I think, from an analysis of the scriptures of the Tanakh. And these 7 are